are military analytics. Every war is the result of a crisis. But sometimes this crisis can lead to other crises. The result of a growing crisis can be a major defeat. The crisis in Russia is growing every day. If these crises increase even more, Russia could collapse completely. The latest crisis in Russia has revealed just how bad Putin is. After Kadyrov's move, Russian commanders and the Kremlin leadership are in a panic. The Russian army is in a very difficult situation. So what is going on in Russia? What was Kadyrov's move? Why is this move so important? The success of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield is causing chaos in Russia. The latest crisis in Russia is the result of the success of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian commanders are gaining a huge advantage on the battlefield by organizing special operations in strategic areas. Ukrainian commanders have recently stepped up their operations to capture Russian soldiers in many regions. The Ukrainian army is conducting sudden operations and surrounding the Russian soldiers. Desperate Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army organized one of these operations in the city of Bakhmut. Ukrainian soldiers had been preparing for this operation for a long time. Ukrainian intelligence also supported this operation. Ukrainian intelligence determined the date and the time of the operation. After receiving the order for the operation, Ukrainian soldiers began to move forward quietly. It was known that there were Chechen soldiers in a boarding house in Bakhmut. Ukrainian soldiers surrounded this hostel and called on the Chechen soldiers to surrender. The Chechen soldiers realized that they were cornered. If the fighting started, the victory was impossible. Chechen soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. They were taken to Kiev and interrogated. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has launched a special study. As you know, in all wars, prisoners are exchanged between the parties. So the Ukrainian government started negotiations with Russia to exchange prisoners again. As a result of these negotiations, a new prisoner exchange agreement was concluded between the two countries. As a result of this agreement, Chechen soldiers were sent to Russia. But this is when the crisis started. The Ukrainian government sent Chechen soldiers to Grozny airport. The Chechen soldiers thought that they would be welcomed back home as war veterans. All prisoners of war are considered heroes and are given the title of veteran. But for the Chechen soldiers, it was different. No government officials came to the airport to welcome them, except for some mid-level local officials and the families of the soldiers. No one paid any attention to them. This strange situation surprised everyone. The Chechen soldiers were very disappointed. This incident soon became the talk of Russia. The Russian press started criticizing Kadyrov for not welcoming the soldiers. After the criticism increased, Kadyrov made a statement on the issue. However, after this statement, all hell broke loose. Kadyrov wrote in a telegram that a Chechen fighter must prove that he has no choice but to be captured. Kadyrov was extremely angry at the Chechen soldiers who surrendered. Kadyrov continued to make statements on this issue. "You need to prove that you are not running away from the war by returning to the front," he said. He said Chechen soldiers who had just returned from the war zone and were reunited with their families after a long time should rejoin the army as soon as possible. Kadyrov emphasized that it was a matter of honor. As a result of Chechen leader Kadyrov's statements, everyone in Russia was stunned. But Chechen soldiers were the most surprised. Chechen soldiers felt that they were not trusted. One Chechen soldier then told the Russian press about his experiences. The Chechen soldiers said they had no chance in the fighting in this area. He said that Ukrainian soldiers organized a very successful operation. The heavy defeat of the Russian army on the front line has become a hot topic in Russia. Russian people became more aware of the bad situation in the war. The soldiers' statement angered Putin. Russian leader Putin decided to meet with Chechen leader Kadyrov on this issue. However, Kadyrov was very harsh with him. Kadyrov made another statement on this issue in his statement. He implied that Chechen soldiers were being oppressed by the Russian army. Kadyrov emphasized that Chechen soldiers reported that they ran out of ammunition before they were captured and Russian commanders failed to solve this problem. Kadyrov also said that Russian commanders did not give Chechen soldiers enough ammunition. According to Kadyrov, Chechen soldiers had been warned to use their ammunition very sparingly. Following Kadyrov's statements, minorities living in Russia have been outraged against Putin's government. Many allegations of mistreatment of soldiers by Russian commanders began to spread. As a result of the increasing tension in the country, a crisis broke out in the Russian army. Chechen soldiers started to rebel against the orders of Russian commanders. The hierarchical structure within the Russian army is breaking down. Russian commanders cannot maintain order within the army. It is said that Chechen soldiers are very likely to start a revolt against Russian commanders. The Kremlin leadership is holding emergency meetings to resolve this crisis. But none of these meetings are working. Kadyrov's story has caused great tension in Russia, especially Chechens are very angry against Russia. On the other hand, demands for independence are growing in the countries that are part of the Russian Federation, especially. Young people in these countries now want to be independent from Russia. According to research in Russia, most of the soldiers joining the Russian army are from minorities. Putin is sending youth from minority regions to war. After this situation was revealed, anti-Putin sentiments started to spread. In minority regions, especially the Chechen people now want to be an independent country from Russia. Putin is worried about the growing demands for independence in Russia. He wants to solve this problem, but for that he needs the support of minority representatives. Meanwhile, the crisis in the Russian army is growing rapidly. The Russian press is reporting dozens of reports of fights between soldiers. There have been many fights in the Russian army since the beginning of the war. However, it is known that fights have increased more recently. These fights are causing the Russian army's success on the battlefield to decline. The Russian army is suffering a heavy defeat. Kadyrov's statements are causing more problems in the Russian army. Kadyrov's statements could completely change the political balance in Russia. Russian people are eagerly waiting for Kadyrov's new statements. What do you think about this crisis in Russia? Do you think Kadyrov is right? Do you think the Russian army will win this war? Do you think the countries of the Russian Federation will gain independence? The Ukrainian army inflicts great damage on the Wagner troops in Bakhmut. Wagner PMC units are stuck in deep, dark tunnels in the underground part of the Artyomovsky metalworking plant. We will provide information about this in the coming minutes. But first, let's take a look at what happened in the Battle of Bakhmut. Undoubtedly, the fiercest conflicts of the Ukrainian war take place in Bakhmut for both the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. Bakhmut is more important than winning the entire war. Almost 70% of the Russian army's strength in Ukraine is now in Bakhmut. Russian President Vladimir Putin is devoting all his strength there so that his army can take Bakhmut and offer its people a war win. However, despite all these efforts, the offensive operations of the Russian army cannot pass the steel curtain of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, has increased its defense in Bakhmut. Not passing Russian troops west of Bakhmut is currently the only priority for Ukrainian defense units. They are aware that if Russia takes control of Bakhmut, they will advance towards the west of Ukraine, and they are shaping their war effort accordingly. Apart from the Ukrainian army and Russian troops, Wagner elements appear as a third force in Bakhmut, purely there to support the Russian war effort and increase firepower. Wagner is officially crushed when confronted by the Ukrainian military, as he uses mostly semi-trained Russian prisoners. To put it this way, Russia loses an average of 200 to 400 soldiers a day, especially in Bakhmut. And at least 100 of these casualties are Wagner PMC soldiers. So it has become essential for the Ukrainian army to clear Bakhmut of Wagner before the Russians. Fighting in the underground part of the Artyomovsky metalworking plant is difficult since the depth of the underground complex is about 350 meters. And this doesn't allow the use of artillery and grenade launchers due to the risk of collapse of the underground complex, which consists of deep, endless tunnels. However, two well-informed sources immediately confirm the fact that the Ukrainian units managed to go quite far. But there are a significant number of Wagner PMC soldiers here. Clearing the underground complex may take a very long time, but this part of the venture cannot be abandoned as it is linked to other areas in the city and could lead to an unexpected counterattack by the Russian army. The compression of the Wagner PMC units in the underground complex forces to stop the advance on the ground. But the Ukrainian units managed to gain ground here quite successfully. Fierce fighting continues in the western part of Artyomovsk. Artillery units are still actively used by both the Wagner PMC units and the forces of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army's efforts to clear the Wagner troops from Bakhmut is very important for the cause of the Bakhmut war. Clearing Bakhmut of Wagner is important to the Ukrainian army, as Wagner troops counted most of the Russian forces in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army fires thousands of shells a day as it tries to hold the eastern city of Bakhmut. It's a pace that US and European officials say is unsustainable and could jeopardize a planned spring campaign, which they hope will be decisive. So what kind of negativities can this ammunition expenditure speed cause in the future? Two US officials said the bombardment was so intense, highlighting the tension between Ukraine's decision to defend Bakhmut at all costs and hopes of regaining the land in the spring. One of these officials said the US had warned Ukraine against wasting ammunition at a crucial time, with so much emphasis placed on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The US and ANC are preparing to send thousands of NATO and Soviet-style artillery shells and rockets to help provide supplies for an impending Ukrainian offensive. But a senior US defense official described it as a last-ditch effort, as Ukraine's allies don't have enough ammunition to keep up with Ukraine's pace and their stockpiles are critically low. Western producers are ramping up production, but it will take months before new sources begin to meet demand. This puts Kiev in an increasingly dangerous position. It's likely that their troops will have a meaningful opportunity this year to launch the offensive, push back the Russian forces, and retake Russian-controlled territory after the war started last year, and likely will have done so as they grapple with the constant shortage of ammunition. Adding to the uncertainty, Ukrainian losses were so severe that several officials said commanders would have to decide whether to send troops to defend Bakhmut or use them in a spring offensive. Most officials spoke on condition of anonymity as they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly. Poland said it would send 4 Soviet-designed MiG fighter jets to Ukraine, marking the first delivery of fighter jets by a NATO country and a sign that Western allies are determined to find ways to improve Ukraine's chances. But artillery, including howitzers and mortars, became the defining weapon of the war in Ukraine. Both sides have powerful anti-aircraft systems, so the battle is largely waged on the ground as the year-long war continues. An important factor in who perseveres is which side has enough ammunition and troops. It's estimated that more than 200,000 Russians have been killed since the start of the war. Ukrainian losses are still uncertain. Russia can recruit from its population about 3 times the size of Ukraine, but both sides struggle with ammunition shortages. Russia's formations are firing more ammunition than Ukraine's. "We need bullets for hand cannons," said a Ukrainian soldier who recently fought in Bakhmut. He said that his battalion was not being supplied. A Ukrainian tank commander whose T-80 tank was used to defend the city said that there was almost no tank ammunition left. Another commander in a brigade that was instrumental in holding Bakhmut reported a catastrophic shortage of bullets. He described an incident in which his unit disabled an advanced Russian E-90 tank but was forbidden to fire artillery because it was too expensive. The Pentagon estimates that Ukraine fires several thousand artillery shells a day along the 600-mile front line, which includes Bakhmut, a city almost besieged by Russian troops. Moscow forces control roughly 40% of the city and are damaging the supply lines that Ukrainians need to defend the rest. The US hopes to produce 90,000 shells per month, but this is likely to take 2 years. The European Union is pooling resources to manufacture and purchase nearly 1 million rounds, which will take time. And the secret UK task force is spearheading efforts from around the world to find and purchase the Soviet-style munitions that Ukraine mainly relied on. Ukraine has about 350 howitzers supplied by the West and significantly more Soviet air artillery pieces. Even with battlefield losses and mechanical failures, Ukraine should be supported more to provide more weapons. There are doubts about the effectiveness of ex-Soviet air weapons, and the best solution would be to find opportunities to increase production in NATO member states. So how can the ammunition problem be solved? This is not easy, even for some of the most advanced armies in the world. The United States and its allies did not stockpile weapons in anticipation of securing an artillery war. Hundreds of new tanks and armored vehicles sent to Ukraine will certainly help its progress. But without adequate artillery support, their effects will be limited. For now, the Biden administration is confident that Bakhmut will not deplete Ukraine's arsenal and troops enough to destroy a spring counterattack. But the longer the war lasts, the more likely it is to change. Ukrainians are losing. I don't want to take this lightly, but they do not suffer casualties as large in scale as the Russians. However, numbers alone do not tell the story of Bakhmut, where one of the toughest battles of the war was experienced. The Kremlin-backed Wagner paramilitary group is using ex-convicts units to break through the Ukrainian lines. This means that combat veterans from Ukraine die while defending the city against less-range Russian infantry. Bakhmut is a small city, but it provides road access further east and has become symbolically important to both sides. But there is no part of Ukraine that can be said to be abandoned. The Biden administration did not set a timeline for the war there, saying on the Ukraine could decide whether to withdraw or continue fighting. Ukraine's demonstration that it will defend its territory is both politically important and militarily necessary, but they need to show that it's valuable. This is not to say that there is no tactical reason to pursue the protracted effort in Bakhmut. It could deplete Russia's resources and prevent its troops from advancing west, where they could gain another breakthrough for Moscow.